Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit.
Sisters and brothers, theys and them, all your citizens of the world, welcome to Live from the Heartland for the week of June 26th. And am I right with that? Yes, I was. And our next guest is the one and only Flint Taylor, and Euan's going to fill us in a little bit about just who our friend Flint Taylor is.
Yeah, I had the great pleasure of listening to Flint Taylor talk to us at Haymarket Books about his new work, The Conviction Machine. He's a friend of the show and a founding member of Chicago's People's Law Office, who represented the families of slain Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark for over a dozen years, and continues to represent many survivors of police torture and wrongful convictions here in Chicago. He's co-counsel in the Malcolm X assassination case. He's also the author of the award-winning historical memoir and the predecessor to this current book, The Torture Machine. So, Flint, welcome to the show. You've been busy writing up a life of changing the narrative about how the Chicago police have told us they've gone about their business. Tell us a little bit about The Torture Machine, your first book.
Well, it's great to be back with both of you. I always enjoy talking with you and being on the show. The first book, The Torture Machine, chronicled the cases that I was involved in here in Chicago, starting as a law student and being involved, as you mentioned, for 13 years in the police assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and that cover-up that went all the way up to the FBI in Washington. And, of course, with Edward Hanrahan, the prosecutor, and the 14 raiding Chicago police officers. The book then primarily focused on the Burge police torture scandal here in Chicago, and I and others at the People's Law Office were involved and continue to be involved over 40 some odd years now in fighting against and exposing the Burge torture-related scandal here in the city of Chicago and various court and political actions that have taken place and continue to take place around those cases.
So why was the first book called The Torture Machine?
It was called The Torture Machine for a couple of reasons. First of all, as you can see on the front of the book, there's depicted the torture machine, which was an electric shock box that was used by John Burge in torturing many of the suspects, the black suspects that he and his men brought into Area 2 on the south side of Chicago to interrogate. It was a box that inside of it had a generator, kind of the same kind of generator that was used in Vietnam to generate electricity when they talked over the field telephones. It had a crank on it, and they attached wires to it, and then they could put those clips on people on their various parts of their body and crank the generator and send electric current through people and shock them as part of their interrogation techniques. The actual box was thrown into either Lake Michigan or the river, Chicago River, by Burge when it started to become known that he was using this box. But we were able to have one reconstructed, and that based on the description that Andrew Wilson, one of the victims of police torture and Burge police electric shock, had given to us. So that is the first piece of The Torture Machine. And of course, as most people in Chicago are familiar with, the term the machine. The Democratic machine, the Daley machine, however you want to term it, this was part and parcel of what was going on in terms of the assassination of Fred Hampton and later the Burge torture scandal, that the machine, that the politicians, that the prosecutors, that the judges, along with the police department, were all wrapped up in this violence, in this murderous violence. So the connection then was the torture box, the torture machine, and the Democratic torture machine. Yes, to the machine that politically, as I mentioned, dealt with the torture and kept it suppressed and facilitated it for decades.
And so that leads you to your new book, The Conviction Machine.
Exactly.
So how do we move from a torture machine to conviction machine, and what is the step in the process? I should note the subtitle is Prosecutors, Politicians, and Police Violence in Chicago. So we're adding a layer here with the prosecutors and politicians.
Yes, well, in the torture machine, of course, I mentioned and pointed out various prosecutors that were intimately involved in the various torture cases that I documented. And I also mentioned the prosecutors that were involved in planning and covering up the Hampton raid. But this time, I looked very much more closely to the roles of those prosecutors and the politicians and the judges who are involved in these cases. And of course, because the primary focus was prosecutors, and of course also what prosecutors bound and designated to do within the system and within the racist system of injustice that we live under, is to prosecute and convict. And so the conviction machine then became a way to characterize what I'm talking about, because in the book, I'm talking primarily about the prosecutors and politicians and judges that were involved in the Hampton scandal. And I'm also talking about the prosecutors in the Wilson case, the granddaddy of the police torture cases, and that 40-year history of prosecutors from the top, Richie Daley, all the way down to the prosecutors who covered up during the case and committed perjury. And of course, going back to Hampton, you have Ed Hanrahan, who was large and in charge of the Hampton raid, who was second in line under Richard J. Daley, the mayor for many years in the 50s and 60s. And he was the one who called the shots along with the FBI in the Hampton raid, and then very loudly proclaimed it was a shootout and told various large lies, Trumpian-type lies along the way, and that I talk about how we and other lawyers and the Panthers and the activists fight against those lies over that 13 years of litigation and struggle to change the narrative in that case, as we subsequently did in the torture cases.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you a question. Give me an example of some of the stuff that these prosecutors did that would make them culpable in this. And then I think I've been making a little note here that said, are there any, as both your books are out now, and they really go at it in pointing out just the terrible acts that were committed. And I'm wondering if there's any chance that legal repercussions for any of these people, or just their rep, if we get enough publicity and people in the news decide to say, oh, yeah, Daley was terrible, look what he did, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, as I alluded to with regard to the Hampton case, Hanrahan and his first assistant were in the room where they had the floor plan that showed where Hampton would be sleeping. That came from the FBI and the informant O'Neill and the COINTELPRO program of the FBI. They were in the room as the police, and they plotted the raid at 4 a.m. in the morning to go down there and fire what turned out to be 90 bullets into that apartment, with Panthers only getting off one shot in defense. Hanrahan and the other prosecutors not only were involved in a publicity campaign to push this lie about it being a shootout, but also were using the various courts to, in fact, try to prosecute the victims who survived, the Panthers themselves, charging them with attempted murder, manipulating grand juries, coroner's inquests, for example. And then it goes into, and to the second part of your question is what can be or was done. In the Hampton case, ultimately because of the public outcry, particularly in the Black community, there was so much pressure that they actually appointed a special prosecutor. And a special prosecutor, Barnabas Sears, attempted to prosecute Hanrahan and the raiders. And the book goes into great length, The Conviction Machine, and talking about how the political powers that be, starting with the mayor and the judge Power, who was the mayor's man on the court, a chief judge, how they manipulated the system to first try to keep Hanrahan from being charged, and ultimately, when he was being charged, appointing a judge right out of DePaul who tried the case, and they tried it before him rather than taking a jury because they knew what the result would be. So in 1972, Hanrahan and several other prosecutors and the police that raided the apartment went on trial. The trial went on for months and months. But the fix was in, literally and figuratively. And a month before, when Hanrahan was up for re-election, the judge entered a verdict without even hearing the defense having to put on any evidence, and threw out the case against Hanrahan and the raiders. So Daley and Hanrahan then were pretty confident that he would then be reelected because he could say, well, I was acquitted. But the Black community was completely outraged by that, went to the polls and for Democratic, and voted Hanrahan out of office. So the people's verdict was the vote that trumped, so to speak, the judge's acquittal of Hanrahan and his people. So that was the first attempt, Michael, to your question about what can happen with regard to the legal system and then the political system in terms of dealing with this kind of police violence that prosecutors have their fingerprints on. It's very difficult to get a conviction in court of cops or prosecutors. And we see that again 50 years later in the torture cases, in the Wilson case. But if the people rise up and do what they did in 1972, what they did at various points in the torture scandal, in terms of getting people out of prison, in terms of getting the UN to consider the case, and also ultimately getting Burge fired and indicted and convicted of perjury, which was quite unusual to say the least. And of course, reparations for our survivors of police torture, which was obtained in 2015. All those kinds of things that the movement and the people can do, primarily outside of the courtrooms, because when couple of the prosecutors in the Jackie Wilson case acted so outrageously and committed perjury, allegedly, and obstruction of justice. Again, here we are 50 years later, and as the book tells the story, they're charged by a special prosecutor, and they go to trial in front of a judge who's a former prosecutor, and then the judge throws their case out because there's no jury in that case either. So what goes around comes around in terms of the attempts to prosecute prosecutors. And that's part of what I talk about in the book. And I talk about alternatives to the prosecutions in those cases and what happened in those attempts to prosecute the prosecutors who were so deeply implicated in police violence and cover-up.
Flint, before we go to a break, I know that our listeners and viewers are pretty familiar with Fred Hampton, the leader of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, who was assassinated while having been drugged in his bed How about telling us a little bit about the Wilson brothers? Because I don't know if people are quite as familiar.
Well, the Wilson brothers were charged ultimately with the killing of two white police officers in 1982. And there was a 5-day manhunt in the Black community here in Chicago looking for them that terrorized the community. And ultimately, they were captured and taken to the Area 2 police station where John Burge ran the show. And they tortured mercilessly Andrew Wilson and his brother Jackie. And Andrew initially was sent to death row. His case was reversed, and he got 2 life sentences, as did Jackie. Several cases were brought in federal court, civil rights cases. We were involved in them. And in the process of those cases, not only a one-off with regard to the Wilson brothers, but it was a systemic torture ring that Burge ran for 20 years, where over 125 African-American men were tortured at the station house that Burge ran. So that is the background of the Wilson case. Jackie Wilson spent 36 years in jail until we were ultimately able to get a new trial. It was the 3rd trial he had. And in that pandemic trial that we had during the pandemic, he was exonerated. His confession was found to have been tortured from him. He was released from prison after 36 years. The judge gave him a certificate of innocence, and ultimately we brought a civil suit for him, and the city and the county won a $30 million settlement for Jackie for his 36 years in the penitentiary and his torture.
We are talking with Flint Taylor of the People's Law Office, the Chicago People's Law Office, and we've been talking about his new book, The Conviction Machine. And Flint, I had a question. I wondered if there has been, we had these state's attorneys that were part of the political machine that covered up a lot of these torture cases that you've written about. I'm wondering if there's any change when a non-machine candidate came into office, which happened when Kim Foxx came in, and I'm not sure where we're at now with this new person. I don't think she's a progressive.
Yes, if you trace the history, which I talk about in the book, it starts, of course, with Hanrahan, who was a major machine operative back in the late 60s and early 70s. And then we have a respite with the Bernie Carey, who was voted in by the Black community, a Republican that actually was a moderate Republican back in those days. Didn't do much to change things, whether, the culture was so extreme, the racist culture within the prosecutor's office. They even had a program within the state's attorney's office. They had a scale in their underneath their desk there, where they in the courtroom, and they would weigh the defendants, the Black defendants, and they had a contest, and it was called N-word by the pound. And prosecutors who got convictions, they would weigh the defendants that they got the convictions or the plea deals from. And after a certain period of time, the prosecutors with the largest number of pounds would win the contest. And that's the kind of racism that was embedded in the state's attorney's office, to say nothing of the fact of who they prosecuted, who they targeted, and the sentences they got against those folks. After that brief respite, we end up with Richie Daley, who was very much a machine person. He was the head of the state's attorney's office when the Wilson brothers were tortured, and he was specifically informed of that and did nothing other than to cover that up. We then go into the 90s, and we see Richard Devine. Another major machine person was the first assistant to Richie Daley back in the torture days. He lasted for 8 years. And then Anita Alvarez came in, who was another machine state's attorney. But then finally, we get to Kim Foxx. And Kim Foxx was having to deal with an office, the largest office in the country in terms of the number of attorneys, that had that kind of ingrained culture, that culture of racism, that culture of win at all costs, and that just the total mass incarceration approach to their prosecuting. And she really fought against that in many ways. And some of her reforms were meaningful in terms of bond, in terms of dealing with misdemeanor cases, and in terms of trying to lessen the population at Cook County Jail through bond and through that kind of thing. And dealing with wrongful convictions in a meaningful way, which had never been done before. She stayed in for 8 years and made some of those changes, but she was swimming upstream the whole time. And of course, the right wing and the Fraternal Order Police and all their buddies and in the prosecutor's office, when they seized on the Jesse Smollett case, which got so much publicity because she had given a deal to him in line with how she was treating misdemeanor cases. And so they jumped all over her for that. And it was an extremely racist attack on her, whatever you think about the Smollett case. And she had to fight that off. She did. But after 8 years, I think she got a little tired of fighting those battles. And she decided not to run a year or two ago. And there was a mildly progressive black candidate who ran in the primary against a machine candidate by the name of Burke. And Burke won by a small margin. And now she's been in for, I don't know, a year or two. And she's rolling back as much of what Kim Foxx did as possible, and is taking a very strong prosecutum type of approach, more sentences, higher sentences, less bond, fighting wrongful conviction cases, all of that kind of thing. So it's kind of returning to the past in a very unfortunate way in the prosecutor's office.
So I want to just go quickly back to something you said about Richie Daly, who obviously subsequently became mayor. You mentioned in your comment then that he was aware of the police misconduct under John Burge. How was he aware of that?
Well, the story is that Andrew Wilson was so brutally tortured that they left all sorts of bruises and burns. He was burned against a hot radiator. He was tortured, and they put the clips on his ears so you could see the marks on his ears. And his lawyers at that time took pictures of those marks. And he told a prison doctor about this. The prison doctor saw all the injuries. He heard about the electric shock. And so he wrote a letter to the chief of police at that time, Richard Brezek. And Brezek was political adversary of Daley. And so Brezek, to his not to his benefit, of course, or not to, and shouldn't be commended for this at all, but he passed on this letter to Daley. He kind of passed the ball to his adversary and said, here's the letter, here's what happened to Andrew Wilson according to the doctor, but I'm not going to do anything unless you tell me to, as the prosecutor. And of course, Daley then huddled with all of his people, including the Devine, and they decided not only would they not do anything, but they would make sure that this was covered up, and then they would proceed using Burge and his people, the ones who had tortured, as witnesses against Wilson, the Wilson brothers. So in that sense, Richie was right in and was aware of the torture right in 1982. And then, of course, he continued to be the prosecutor for the next 7 or so years. And under that period of time, scores of black men were tortured by Burge and his people, and several or many were sent to death row, primarily on the basis of these tortured confessions.
Flint, when we were talking about this current state's attorney, Burke, she's been at odds with the mayor and various congressional representatives, et cetera, around ICE and the imprisonment of people being held in Bridgeview, I believe. And I know you've just written a piece about Bridgeview and the demonstrations out there against ICE. We have a couple minutes left. Please tell us about your article that's about to appear.
Well, our office represented one of the Broadview Six, and was also was out at Broadview. Several of our young lawyers were legal observers out there, and of course, ICE invaded Chicago in the fall. They killed they shot and killed a person and wounded another, and just terrorized people in the communities and out at Broadview, which was, of course, the holding center for the people that ICE was snatching and kidnapping off the streets. And so the prosecutors focused on six demonstrators, most of whom were connected to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and prosecuted them. Well, they tried to prosecute them, but the grand jury wasn't having any of it. And the grand jurors, many of them protested and said they didn't want to bring an indictment. One of them called the case a crock of shit. He was kicked off of the grand jury by the prosecutor in front of the grand jury. The defendants do get transcripts from what happens in front of the grand jury, but that usually just is testimony. But in this case, in the spring, there was people understood, the lawyers understood that something very unusual or went on in front of that grand jury in order to get those indictments. But this grand jury would not countenance the kind of case that they were trying to get an indictment from. And it took 3 different sessions for them to browbeat this jury into bringing the indictments. Well, this all came out. And not only did this come out, but it came out that the U.S. attorney had come in front of that grand jury and intimidated them to get that indictment. And so because of all of this, Hearst trying to cover up these transcripts was forced to dismiss the cases. And it's still under investigation in terms of what sanctions or other recourse the judge a federal judge who was the judge on the Broadview case can take or will take against these prosecutors and the government for their misconduct in this case. But thankfully, the case was dismissed. It was a bogus beginning conspiracy case and harkens back to decades ago. And I wrote an article about that, and as well as other cases that the government is taking up across the country, conspiracy cases using statutes that were written during Reconstruction from conspiring against federal officials. They're using it now against left demonstrators. They've done it in Texas. They have done it in Spokane. They are doing it in the Palestinian 8 case in Michigan, and they're doing it now attempting to fight back against the resistance in Minneapolis. They've indicted 15 people under that same statute. So their forces of repression, front lines, the ICE, are losing those battles. They're losing the individual battles when they bring cases against people in court. So now they're resorting to conspiracy, broad-based conspiracy indictments against demonstrators, pro-Palestinian demonstrators in Michigan, anti-ICE demonstrators in Minneapolis. So I've written about all of those cases and linking all of those cases together, and also pointing out that the tactics that the FBI and Trump are writing about are tactics of disruption, of dismantling, the same kind of language that Hoover was using in the secret COINTELPROs of the 60s in order to destroy organizations such as the Panthers, King, Carmichael, Malcolm X.
Where's it published? Going to be published?
In Truth Out. Truth Out
Good.
Website.
Okay, Flint, thanks so much for coming on the show. We'll have you on again. You never know how soon, but We'll be back. Don't forget, everybody, to check out this new book, The Conviction Machine. We're taking